Hello, brothers and friends. I'm Bill Hattendorf. Like we've done at some of the mid-year leadership retreats and some row regionals and conventions, we thought it might be fun to share a few fireside chats. When I think of those chats, I usually rely a little bit on the back and forth, talking with what's on the mind of who's ever in the group. But since it's being recorded, there's not much chance of that today. So we'll just start with a little history today. By the way, I know spring has sprung in most parts of the country, but here in New England, we still had snow a few days ago. And it's below freezing at night still, so it doesn't seem strange to be sitting here by the fire and feels much more legitimate to call it a fireside chat. This coronavirus quarantine is one of the few interruptions we've ever had to our fraternity operations. It's certainly not the first illness to sweep across the country and the world in such a dramatic way. I hope you're staying safe and well and maybe quarantining productively, doing things you don't have time to do normally. I personally have been catching up on some reading, a bunch of different things, but finding myself drawn to the Great World War and the Spanish flu, a huge pandemic of a century ago. Partly because of my work editing a new version of the Kaisai story and adding to the history there, I've been reading a lot of old issues of the P&G, and the alpha editors or reporters of the time reflect pretty well on what was going on around them and with the war and the flu. The Great World War, which didn't become World War I until a couple of decades later when we did another one, that war didn't close down fraternity operations particularly like the Civil War did rather completely in the South, or that World War II did everywhere else, or everywhere, period. But in the last half of 1917 and pretty much all of 1918, many Kaisai undergraduates and classmates answered the call to help defeat those aggressors, if you will, in the war in Europe. The war began in 1914, as you remember, with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. The US didn't join until April 1917, at that point then making the difference in turning the tide of the war. That World War in 4 years caused about 20 million deaths, half military, half civilian. And of those overall deaths, about half came from direct military causes and the other half from disease and starvation. But separate from that war was an even bigger killer. 102 years ago, we had a major outbreak of influenza. It was the 1918 virus pandemic, H1N1, or what many called then the Spanish flu. The virus actually didn't come from Spain, we're pretty sure. More probably, it actually came from a military base in Kansas and then deployed with our soldiers over to Europe. It was the deadliest pandemic in modern history. There was no vaccine against it then. Control efforts were limited to things like isolation, personal hygiene, disinfectants, curtailed public gatherings. Sound familiar? People didn't like to be quarantined, of course, and control measures were applied rather unevenly. The virus was relatively mild that first spring of 18, and seemed to fade over the summer until the fall when an even deadlier second wave began. Early on, many officials tried to downplay the epidemic. They didn't want to damage morale for the war effort and didn't want to hurt the economy. Imagine this, President Woodrow Wilson made no public statements about it whatsoever, not a single news conference, nothing. And the Surgeon General said there was no cause for alarm if proper precautions were taken. It was just, another flu. One authoritative public health official, whose name escapes me at the moment, called it an ordinary influenza by another name. Because of the war and the pandemic, enrollment in most colleges was down during World War I, and so fraternity membership was down as well. There weren't enough Kaisais to fill many of our lodges, so some lodges actually got rented out to boarders or more often turned over to the Student Army Training Corps, or SATC, which you can think of as sort of a forerunner of the ROTC. The smaller number of Kaisais on campus did their best to keep things going, even living in temporary apartments or facilities for some of them. But no Alpha officially closed during the war. No membership went to zero. That flu outbreak, well, it was estimated that at least 500 million people, or more than a quarter of the entire worldwide population, was infected with the virus. Seemed like everybody had it. And 50 million people died worldwide, or 1 in 10 of those affected. About 2/3 of a million people, 675,000 in the United States, died from it. So more people died of the Spanish flu than from all wars of the 20th century combined. We don't seem to have any reliable Kaisai statistics on it, but from reports in the Purple and Gold, we know that a number of Kaisai undergraduates died from it, right there on campus even in many cases. Our best guess is about a dozen. And certainly the number of alumni was at nationwide averages, I suspect, as well. Some colleges did a better job of others than isolating folks, just like some homes did. But it wasn't just Kaisai and other students dying, of course, but faculty and staff as well. In Chapel Hill, for example, the president of the university died of Spanish flu. And then in short order, his replacement also died from it. Just sort of one shock after another around the country. It was a big deal. Let's look back further in time, though, to Kaisai's second decade. When Kaisai extended into our southern schools in the 1850s, no one could see the long gathering dark clouds of war that would break and deluge the whole country. No one could imagine that virtually all the students in the colleges and all the colleges would be closed and for students enrolled in the Army. Nobody could guess how long it would take to recover. But there it was. All the bright prospects of our new fraternity movement were sort of blasted at once in Charlottesville, Columbia, Oxford, Greenville, and Chapel Hill. In one brief moment, the work of years was erased when, on the 12th of April, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire in Charleston Harbor on Fort Sumter, thus beginning the bloodiest conflict in American history. More than 655,000 Americans died, about the same as in all other American wars combined. All the Southern Alphas closed, and most of the members joined the Army. In the 6 years of existence of Alpha Sigma at North Carolina, for example, there had been 50 men initiated, 49 of whom are known to have served in the Confederate Army. 10 of those 50 died in the war, 1 out of 5 of all their initiates. And the story was pretty much the same at Virginia, South Carolina, Mississippi, Furman. Emotion-filled last dinners, a bonfire burning of the records, final toasts for bosom buddies who didn't know when or if they'd ever see each other again. The effects on Northern Alphas were not much less disastrous, and no Alpha on either side of the Mason-Dixon line sent less than its quota to the front. The Civil War is, of course, this nation's most defining experience, and some say it's still being fought in many places, both North and South. Just imagine being part of this exciting, relatively new fraternity movement, maybe petitioning for several years before earning a charter, full of hopes and dreams of the future, and then Civil War breaks out, and you find yourself in the Army, your fraternity burning all its records, your college going out of business. You've probably heard tales about families being split apart on different sides of the war. Kaisai brothers from some Alphas found themselves split apart as well, as many Alphas, especially those in the North, had members from other sections of the country. The Alpha Pi had, when it was founded even in 1841, almost half the brothers were from somewhere south. Choosing sides was never easy, and being on sides was never easy. I hope you've read in the Kaisai story or elsewhere the thing called the Kaisai War incident, where a brother from one army lends succor and assistance to a brother from the other army because of an open coat where he caught a glimpse of a Kaisai badge. The two men recognized that the war, with all its horrors, was separating them. But even so, there was a bond that existed between them, a Kaisai bond that nothing could ever sever. The story closes with a few words. The vital principles of our order withstood the test of grim-visaged war. How strong must it grow, and how deep in our affection must it implant its roots in the days of peace and harmony. After the war, 4 of those 5 Southern Alphas were able to resume business when their schools opened in 1865, or one of them in 1867, with only Sigma at UNC remaining closed. They had to wait over 60 years, for no really good reason from today's viewpoint, until 1928 to be granted a new charter. In the North, college enrollment suffered greatly, but none of our northern colleges closed down. For Chi Psi, both Alpha Alpha at Wesleyan and Alpha Kappa at CCNY, City College of New York, closed in 1863, largely account on the war and reduced student body. Alpha reactivated at Wesleyan in 1876, but Kappa never restarted, at least yet. The 1862 convention, after a year of war, was attended by only 9 Alphas and included those from the Union side of the Mason-Dixon line. An account of the 1862 convention in the Purple and Gold years later describes the Northerners' sentiments. Several of the delegates stoutly claimed that the Southern Alphas were all defunct and extinct by reason of secession of their states in which they were located, that their members were probably all rebels and traitors, or else they would have been out of the Confederacy long ago and presented themselves at the convention in some way, that they had no right to expect consideration or recognition at our hands. Well, brothers at Hamilton, Wesleyan, and Michigan ended the argument, pointing out that our fraternity was based on letters and on personal friendships, rather than on arms and politics, that it knew no boundary lines or states or countries. It did not help feelings, however, when an announcement was made that just prior to the formal adjournment, that Colonel Frank B. Willard of Hamilton had been killed in a battle at the head of his regiment, being the first Chi Psi to give his life for the Union. The end of the war reunited Chi Psi, with all Alphas coming together physically and spiritually as before. 75 years after that Civil War, in May 1941, and Chi Psi had been planning it for a good while, Chi Psi celebrated its centennial in grand fashion at Union College. There was a war going on in Europe. FDR had been elected to a historic 3rd term, and some younger Chi Psis, like my dad, who had graduated a couple of years earlier from Illinois and Zeta Delta, were joining the service. My dad and his brother were anticipating Americans getting involved, and they signed up to be fighter pilots. And it was the next year when they got sent off to Europe and North Africa. Later that year of 1841, December 7th bombs at Pearl Harbor, though, disrupted fraternity and college life, like no other event has, including the Civil War. A few months later, at the 1942 convention in Ann Arbor, much of the discussion was about the effect of the war on college and fraternities in general, and about Chi Psi in particular. It's hard to imagine what would happen next. Colleges and society were just beginning to figure out what this war thing was going to mean exactly. Some delegates at the 42 convention were in uniform already, and other brothers were sure that they soon would be. A year later, by 1943, no Alpha had regular use of its lodge, and most college-related buildings played some part in the war effort. The end of the whole fraternity system was feared by many and predicted by a few, while a few Alphas tried to carry on as traditionally as possible with a skeleton membership and apart from the lodge. It really wasn't until about 1946, fall of 46, that regular operations resumed on many campuses. With few Chi Psis in school during the war, logically no conventions were held in 1943, 44, or 45, breaking a string of conventions of annual gatherings back to 1848, almost a century. During the war, almost 4,000 Chi Psis were on active duty, and 152 brothers gave their lives for their country. The Purple and Gold devoted large sections of its pages to news of men in service. The storage of ritualistic equipment and such during the war didn't mean an end to fraternal spirit, though. Brothers met each other during the war on battlefields, on faraway islands, on ships at sea. They recognized each other by badges or service rings, or exchange of experiences they'd had back in the States. My own war, where I served, was in Vietnam and Cambodia. And even in those times, the purple and gold listed where brothers were in service, part of alumni news. And I got my purple and gold sent to me over in Cu Chi and other places in Vietnam. I found at least, I remember finding, it may have been more, 2 Kai Sais in particular that I could actually go visit, and did. People I didn't know, but I knew they were Kai Sais, so was able to visit them. Sorry for my parenthetical note there, but when peace finally came, men flocked back to campus to resume their studies after World War II and resume fraternity life as well. They were older, matured by the war. Many had a more serious approach to academics and openness to social change. I think the growth of larger, more impersonal universities, which certainly happened with a bump enrollment there, resulted in a greater need than ever for fraternities, for personal contact and relationships within a smaller group. As I said earlier, the Second World War was the biggest disruption ever to college life. In the earlier events, no more than a portion of our alphas closed down. Within the decline in the students at our institutions, we carried on our operations for the most part, brought in a few new members, and held conventions as best we could. But during World War II, things were different. World War II involved really the whole country in some way. There was such mobilization that over 11% of all Americans were in uniform, and so many more involved in war production and war services of one kind or another at home, home guard and things like that. We didn't say that our alphas officially closed during World War II, but there were really only a few Kai Sais left in school anywhere. Most campuses became military training centers, and every lodge was used for classrooms or military housing, what have you. Similarities from any of these histories with today? You bet. In a way, college life and life in general is completely disrupted right now, as you well know. I personally haven't been inside a gym or a restaurant or a store in well over a month, with my wife very thoughtfully and as safely as possible doing the occasional grocery store runs, keeping social distance and all that sort of thing. I had been to 3 regional conferences earlier this winter and spring, and there were a bunch of other fraternity events I really looked forward to attending as the spring went on. But just after returning from a Region 5 conference in Eugene, yes, that was the first weekend in March, the world changed. That was sort of the line that was drawn. None of us has ever lived through anything quite like this. What will eventually happen, and when? Will we return to normalcy? Will colleges reopen to in-person learning? Will we see our favorite sports teams play live contests again? Will our favorite local pub or restaurant be open to be there in person again? And to me at least, just as important, will Chi Psi and other fraternities open for business again? The answer to all of these questions must be yes. But it may be in a new normalcy, and that new normal could be a very good thing if we're able to figure out how to take advantage of it. After 9/11, for just a little while, the world seemed to change in that instant, at least for a few weeks. Not all of it was good, certainly. There were prejudices that reared their ugly heads, but it seemed for a while that we mostly came together as a kinder, more caring people. That we'd all been through a great trauma together, which, going through it, watching the same TV coverage over and over, somehow united us. The Kennedy assassination in 1963 and Pearl Harbor in 1941 were similar events in the way they brought us together. As a values-based organization, we share a common ideal and spirit that makes us strong. I think we'll come out of this okay. The spirit of Chi Psi that devises our policies and methods and guides us along the way, I think that spirit won't change. That spirit is eternal, We're not wiser than those who came along before us, but we are the heirs of their experience. We're not better than our predecessors in any way, but we can go on using the principles that they taught us, the examples they left us, that have sweetened our lives and ennobled our characters. We will go on. My best wishes to each of you. Stay in touch with your brothers, whether one-on-one phone calls or some Zoom gathering of current buddies or good old friends. As a favorite Minnesota character used to say on his radio show, be well, do good work, and keep in touch. Thanks for listening.